Okay, hello to everybody. Welcome to our 178th Reading Online Sports Economics Seminar. It's always good to have a great range of sports on offer in this seminar series, and this week is another sport that I can't remember the last talk on cycling, so it's good to have one on cycling. We've got Julian Matthes speaking, "Do not put all your legs in one basket, theory and evidence on competition in road cycling." Before Julian starts, he is happy to take questions as he goes along, and he has the usual amount of time, so there will be plenty of time for Q&A at the end, as well as during his talk, if you want to. I should just quickly say before we start that we are, as always, hosted by the University of Reading and sponsored by the Sports Economics Review. So if you are looking for a journal with a good and speedy turnaround rate, the Sports Economics Review is the one for you, edited by Stefan Stefanski and Alex Trumer. I've seen Alex here today. I don't know if Stefan is here today, but they're often attendees. A number of papers presented here have ended up in the journal. The other thing to say is we have a Rose's WhatsApp group, which kind of acts as a bit more of a general chat group for various things, but certainly takes the place of the unreliable Teams chat on Teams. So if you do want to be part of that, drop me an email with your phone number and I can add you to the group. I don't want to hold up Julian any longer, so Julian, please do take away your talk.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thanks for the invitation. Thank you all for being here. Yeah, this is joint work with David Piazzolo, who's also, we're both PhD students at Heidelberg. And I think I'll get to the title, like the pun in the title a bit later, but this title has changed, is maybe an important disclaimer, because we have presented this at the workshop for sports and natural experiments in Zurich, and also in Rotterdam this year. So some of you may have seen this abstract with a different title. It used to be called The Strategic Benefits of Sending Your Friends Away. And I'm not sure, seeing the names, if anybody has been to either of these talks. The paper has changed a little bit. So even if you have seen this before, it may be worthwhile sticking around. We've been through a revision. We have just been accepted for publication at the European Economic Review. So we've put a little bit of work into presenting this in a general interest economics sort of way. This is how the competition turns up in the title. But it's a very natural framework. Road cycling is a very natural framework to study competition in the field, I think. So this worked very well. Yeah, without further ado, I'll get into the cycling. Now I will show you a little video first to get you in the mood, and also to motivate the sort of problems that we're going to investigate. So for this, I need to change what I'm sharing. And I'll show you like 20 seconds of this stage 6 of Tirreno Adriatico in 2022. And the thing I want you to look at is the group that is chasing the one that's breaking away right now. So we see the stage-winning attack of Tadej Pogačar, and the group behind him, the group of favorites in this race, is reacting by actually becoming slower, not faster. So they're not chasing him, they actually start arguing visibly, and they get so slow that another rider is catching up. That Richie Porte, who has been dropped before, actually manages to get back to the group. And they start talking to each other, they keep arguing, while Pogačar is building a larger and larger lead. And this is something that is obviously quite puzzling at first sight. So cycling fans will know this behavior very well. This is something that you observe quite frequently. But it is non-obvious for lay people, and it is interesting for economists, we argue, because there's obviously something of a competition, like cooperation issue going on. So these riders are not managing to cooperate a chase, even though every single rider in the group would actually profit from chasing cohesively in a group. So This is a classical competition problem. If you have a group of guys that want to cooperate on a common outcome, but will compete later on. So this is how this word competition actually, what it's made up of these two words, cooperation and competition. So cooperation among competitors. What's particularly interesting about cycling is that it's not individual riders that compete with each other or cooperate with each other in instances, but that it's actually teams of cyclists. So the actual players in the cycling game are teams, and they have a multidimensional action space, if you want. They have several riders that they can use to do stuff in the race. And we are sort of looking at how cycling teams actually want to use their riders strategically, and what sort of setups of cyclists groups and team distributions within these groups help a group cooperate. So there's two views on this. On the one hand, we're looking at optimal strategy of cycling teams. And on the other hand, we're looking at which characteristics of groups of cyclists in this team framework promote cooperation among competitors. It's a relatively complicated setup, I think, which is why our model is relatively complicated, but the takeaways that we get, I think, are quite simple, and we can also test them empirically. So we will present a rather specialized model that focuses on how the final of a cycling race looks like. And then we will get stylized results out of this model and confirm these predictions, or these like patterns, as we'll call them, with empirical data, which will be data that we just scraped from Pro Cycling Stats, which is a website with a big database of results of cycling races, like the Tour de France, for instance. I probably should have mentioned the Giro d'Italia, like these really big races. And then as a robustness check, we also collected in-race data on group compositions in races for about 5 seasons. So this is like 100 races where we, on referee request, actually looked at the races and documented by hand the compositions of the first groups at the 1 kilometer to go mark. So these are 2 different data sets that we use. Yeah, on this first stage here, the motivation, I think, is sufficiently clear now. You've seen the coordination failure also in the video. There's another picture of this on top of the slide. And then also, for those of you that don't follow cycling, the whole team thing seems a little bit weird at first, because you may have heard of individual cyclists, Lance Armstrong, Jan Ullrich, Tadej Pogačar currently. But teams really do matter, and cyclists and fans are also aware of this. So there's a lot of newspaper coverage of team strengths and team transfers, even though individual riders win. And there is consensus that a team may actually make the difference, even if one team has the strongest rider. If the team of that rider is not strong enough, this may be a problem in a race. These are like newspaper headlines on that topic that we collected in the picture at the bottom. Yeah, so one of the things that you can see there, for instance, is this statement, Tadej Pogačar is vulnerable if Jumbo or Ineos are willing to sacrifice. And this is pretty much what we're going into. Like, how do teams actually sacrifice riders? Okay. So, yeah, I think we need to talk about cycling a little bit more before I can present the model, just for those that aren't familiar. So the general setup of a race in cycling, and in particular of a stage race, which we will focus on, is that you have this big race that consists of smaller races. So the race itself, like the Tour de France, for instance, consists of 21 stages, which are individual days of racing. And each of these stages has a winner. But the winner of the Tour de France is the rider with the lowest time accumulated over all the stages. We're not going to focus on that latter part, on the so-called general classification, but we will look at individual stages. And each of these stages is what you would conventionally think of when you think of a race. It's a bunch of guys, in this case, usually 22 teams of each 8 riders. So about 170 cyclists start riding together, and then they will ride for something between 150 to 250 kilometers. And at the end, there's a finish line, and the first one to cross the finish line is the winner. Because it's easier to ride behind other riders, because riders can shelter you from the wind if you ride behind them, you will usually find these riders in groups. And there's normally one large group that's referred to as the peloton. And the first group of riders is called the breakaway. And it's not actually unusual that you only have these two groups, because there's no point in being in between. But because the peloton is kind of unstable as a group, because people will want to break away, you normally have a very intense phase of racing at the beginning of the race where a breakaway forms. So where riders keep attacking until a stable group of riders has formed, and the peloton actually decides not to chase them. It's a relatively intricate process of these groups endogenously finding each other. And there's a lot of randomness there. So sometimes a breakaway will just slip away, even though the peloton doesn't want to let them go. Sort of depends on how hard, like what the parkour looks like. It's easier to break away if there's hills than in the flat, for instance, because then the drafting is less. So you get some randomness in the breakaway, and this will be very important later on. But at the same time, in order for a breakaway to form, there needs to be consensus among the riders that it actually makes sense to ride in this group. So if there's one heavy favorite and everybody else knows that they don't have a chance against this guy later on, they will probably not ride together. And then once the breakaway has formed, it stays pretty much stable for most of the day. So this is actually 4 or 5 hours sometimes, until the group in the back either decides to catch the breakaway, which means they will work very hard and ride very fast and have a high turnover of riders at the front of the group in order to sustain a harder pace than the breakaway and reel them in. Or each team in the peloton is actually happy with, or the important teams in the peloton actually have a rider in the breakaway, don't chase, and then the breakaway will sprint for the win. And this latter scenario is what we're interested in. So we are interested in only these races where there's a small group of riders arriving like close to the finish, maybe 2-3 kilometers you can think of, and then start attacking each other again. So then the group that has cooperated before will start breaking up, and because some riders will prefer to not sprint against other riders in the group because they know they are faster sprinters. So they'll try to drop them earlier. And this whole breakaway endeavor is usually actually not successful. So most early breakaways are caught. And this is one of the main motivations. We are trying to understand which breakaways are successful, even though this is actually one thing that there has been economic research on before. There's 2 papers, I think, one by Sell et al. And the other one is by Potters and Power. It's in economic psychology, I think. Then the other thing that we're looking at is how to use teammates. So how do teams actually decide to use their teammates? Because generally speaking, there are 2 ways how a team can use teammates. Most teams are built around one very strong rider, a leader. And as you can imagine, if the leader is in the back group and you have a front group that you want to catch, you will potentially use your teammates to actually drag the leader to the front group. So the leader can be in the draft of the helper. And this is something that you can see here on the left. And then they will sort of reel the group in, and then the leader can compete against the other leaders when they're at the front of the race. However, and this is the big problem here, there's a big trade-off. If I use a teammate to drag my leader to the front, I also drag the other leaders. I can prevent them from riding at the back wheel of my leader. So the other thing that I could do is I could have a weaker teammate go up the road to break away. This is what you can see down here on the right, which will now sort of strategically shift the focus of every other rider, because if my leader has a teammate in the group in front, then there's no incentive for him to actually chase if there's an opportunity to win for the helper. Simplified, speaking very simplified here, it depends on if you want to ride for the general classification or for the day. But if I'm Tadej Pogacar and I have a teammate in the group in front, and this is only about winning the day, and my teammate in front can actually win the day from that group, then Pogacar will not need to chase, which might actually mean that his opponents will chase for him. And these two things is what we're going to compare. So when do you want to have your teammates next to you as a captain, and when do you want them away from you in another group to reap strategic benefits? And this is where the title of the paper essentially comes from. So we find that mostly it's advantageous to split your riders up. So to don't put all your eggs in one basket, or in this case, all your legs in one basket. We find both theoretical and empirical advantages of splitting your riders up. This is on this slide, this is actually research question 2. The first one is what I mentioned earlier. We're looking at which groups coordinate well or cooperate well. And this is in general supported by heterogeneity in individual capability. So if you have riders that are strong, that are differently strong, they will cooperate quite well because everybody knows who's the strongest, and the strongest will then will be used to do the work. Everybody that's weaker will say, no, I'm not going to ride in the wind here. I'm weaker than you anyway. So you weaken yourself. And then in equilibrium, they're sort of weakening each other in turn in such a way that everybody believes that they have the same probability of winning in the end. If you have earlier than at the end, all of them at the same win probability, then there will be disorder. Nobody's going to say no. It's not going to be obvious who's going to work. So cooperation sort of dissipates. And we also provide empirical evidence on this. Yeah, so this is the roadmap essentially, and a brief overview over the paper. I would now spend a little bit of time on talking about how this translates beyond cycling, but this is maybe a good time to take first questions, if there are any, on this motivation and the setup. If there's nothing, I'll just move on. So yeah, okay, great. Then I will just move on. So this is the thing that we sort of use, of course, to apologize for the cycling theme to other economists. We say this is something that's not cycling specific. There is competition with diversified actions outside of cycling as well, and there's no research on it until now. So this, and we focus on the distribution aspect. So distributing riders across groups is better than keeping them together. And in generalized fashion, we say that if you diversify productive assets in a framework where there will be some sort of a common good for auction, then you have strategic benefits by diversifying your asset that are strategic, right? These are benefits that go beyond reducing outcome uncertainty, but they are actually like multiplying. So one thing that you could think of is tourism. So there has been some papers on competition in ports. And this is something that we're going to sketch here roughly. Think of two islands and tourism entrepreneurs that have some sort of thing to offer on these islands. So maybe they are, maybe they offer diving courses, maybe they have a hotel there or a restaurant or something, but they have their enterprise on one island and they're fully aware that there's another island that has very similar sort of possibilities for tourists. And there are ferries going to both of these islands to begin with. At first, you can think there's a monopoly. So we have the green entrepreneur and the blue entrepreneur, and they do their thing. And then a red entrepreneur enters one of the islands. And they start talking to each other, the red and the blue one, because they are in competition for tourists on their own island, but they also want to lure the tourists away from the other island. So they would like the black ferry to also go to the white island. And how can they do that? Maybe they actually improve their infrastructure a little bit. So they build a bigger port, or they build maybe a big resort or playground or something that is attractive to tourists. And because they both profit from it, they pay 1/2 of the project each. But now the red entrepreneur actually realizes that he's better off if he also opens up a shop on the other island and talks to the green guy as well and proposes the same deal to the green guy. So now both of the islands are in talks about improving infrastructure. But because the red guy is diversified, he will only pay less than half of the share for the common good because he profits less. He has an outside option. The actual improvement from winning the intergroup competition between the islands is now relatively less for the red guy. So he has to pay less. And this is actually true on both islands, right? So both of these islands will now improve the infrastructure with the red guy paying less than half. And now you may say this is a bit of a stupid example with the two islands because at this point, nobody actually cares if the infrastructure is better. So this is like welfare enhancing for the tourists. But if there's a third island with another group of people on them, for instance, then this is clearly beneficial. But we omitted this for simplicity in this example. So this is essentially a sketch of the strategic benefit of diversification thing that we argue exists in cycling races, and it's also relevant outside of cycling races. Another example could be, and I have no slide on this, but I'll give it to you anyway. If you think of a PhD student that is working with several different PhD students at his department, and each of his co-authors only has one project, then the diversified PhD student is better off. He can give away more than half of the work on each of the papers because he can always pretend his job market paper to be the one with the other co-author. This would be another situation where this sort of diversification is beneficial strategically. Yeah, that's our main finding. So there's existing literature. I'll go through this very quickly. Essentially, the sports part you're probably familiar with. There is a little bit on cycling. There's also larger literature on testing behavioral theories with sports data in different sorts of sports. A lot of it has been presented here. What we do is, our paper is the first cycling paper that strategically analyzes team behavior. Everything else that we were familiar with was either strategy of individual riders, this one is about sprint finishes, or about the prospects of the breakaway. Yeah, question from Alex.
I'm not sure Ignacio would like to see that he did a paper on tennis, which he didn't.
Oh, is it the wrong side? Oh, I'm so sorry. Yes, thanks for pointing that out.
Because actually, I think he even claims that you cannot do study on tennis about mixed strategies. So, yeah.
Yeah. No, I think I changed the literature before this talk, and I made it several parentheses instead of one. So I deleted the wrong one, I think, here.
Well, you could have used my biathlon paper, but that's fine.
Well, I wasn't sure who's going to be here. Okay, yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, so this is the sports part. Then there's also the competition literature, which is mostly in management. And then there's some stuff on collective action in economics and economics of public goods mostly. There's also actually one paper that's a theory paper on simultaneous inter and intra-group conflict, which is quite close, but which doesn't have the diversified actions that we have. So that's the main difference there. And then, as I said, there's these competition problems in tourism and in ports that are quite specific to their field, though. And the one thing that's very new there is our analysis of outside options. Okay, yeah, so much about the introduction. Now we'll get into the model, which I'm going to spend a bit of time on this because I want to present the theoretical results to you by way of examples. But they, of course, hinge heavily on the model. So we do have like one theorem that solves our model, but that's, I think, not a good thing for a talk, but you'll still have to bear with me for a second here. So the one thing that we want you to look at, to sort of abstract away everything that's unimportant in a cycling race, are these little pictures. So I'll have a lot of them later in these examples. You can see them here. So there's one example picture here with 3 teams. So the teams are signified by the colors. We have a black team, a blue team, and a pink team. Then on top of each rider, you will see a lightning and a number next to it, which the number is what we call the energy level of that rider. So what he has to spare. And then sometimes we have these dashes with another number below it, and that is a distance. And the number is quantifying the distance. You can roughly think that 2 energy units are enough to bridge 2 distance units. So there's this translation, but it's not exactly as simple as that, because there's this benefit of drafting, the free riding thing that we need to model. And even though the blue riders and the pink rider, they are portrayed next to each other, we actually put them in the same position. So on this picture, we have 2 different positions. We have 3 riders in position 0. So we always have an integer capturing the position of a rider. And we have the black rider in position 2. And the dash with the 2 below signifies that there's this difference of 2 position units between them. But the position vector is not like an ordinal measure of I'm in first place, I'm in second place, I'm in third place, but it's about at which point on a line am I? Am I in point 0 or 2 or 3 or 4? And then we are interested in the differences between the group positions. And we will track this because the game that these riders play, or that the teams play, is they play a one-shot game in which they can change their positions. And then after they've played this, all the riders that are in the front group, so that have the highest position, can win the race, and they will win the race with a probability that's increasing in the remaining energy. So you want to get to the front of the race, having as much energy as you can possibly keep. So we model this with a Talog contest in this example, but it's robust to all sorts of contests as long as the win probability is increasing in your energy. Talog contest is the simplest because then it's actually proportional. But you will see these examples later, which I think make this a bit more tangible. So the actions in the game that will actually change the positions are 4 different actions, which we try to portray in pictures as well, but I'll go with you through the table line by line. We call the actions R, P, M, and A, and these are abbreviations. So the simplest action is rest, R. And if you rest, that costs you no energy, but you also don't do anything. Your positional impact is small. It's either 0, and this is if there's nobody playing pace, or if there is someone in your group that plays pace, which costs them 1 energy, which is the second action, the positional impact will be 1. And this is also the same for the pace rider. So pacing means riding in front of a group at a controlled pace. And all the riders that are resting will be able to follow at that speed without exerting energy. But the pacer is also not able to follow attacks if they happen. This is the action that happens at the other end of the spectrum. The fastest and hardest thing you can do is to play A, which is attack, that costs you 2 energy and gives you a guaranteed positional impact of +2. The problem with attacking is that if somebody plays mark, which is the last of the actions, which we abbreviate M, they will be able to follow you. So if somebody in my group plays A and I play M, I get a positional impact of +2, but I only exert 1 energy, while the person that actually plays attack has to exert 2 energy units. So another way to think about it is there's free riding opportunities at 2 levels here. You can free ride at speed 1, or you can free ride at speed 2, or you can actually ride speed 1 or ride speed 2. So you have risky and ambiguous actions in a way. So if you think of a long peloton, think of the first rider playing pace and everybody else playing rest. If somebody's attacking away and another guy following him, we actually assume that the guy following exerts less energy. And if somebody's attacking, this is in picture C here, and nobody plays mark, then this rider will actually leave the group and create a split. Yeah, exactly. On this next slide, this is the same thing again, essentially, but I'll go over this quickly. I mean, one thing that's obviously important is that if you only have one energy unit, you can't play attack because it costs you 2. So the action sets are actually endogenous. They depend on the positional impact. Okay, so that's the model. Any questions at this point before I start examples? Okay. Feel free to interrupt me at any point if you're uncertain what exactly I'm saying. So the simplest example I'm going to show you is one that's absolutely not strategic at all, where you have 2 riders that are separated by 2 distance units, and the one in front actually doesn't have any energy left. There's no way to do anything except rest. And the rider behind has 2 energy units, so has all the actions at his disposal. Then the solution to this game is that the pink rider plays attack, catches up, and then they're both in front, both with 0 energy, and they play a Talok contest with this, and they have equal win probabilities, which are also their utilities. So they both gain a utility of 1/2. They both win with probability 1/2. Now the next thing, and this is where an actual game happens, is we take another rider and add it to the second group. So now again, we have the paralyzed, tired black rider in front, and now we have a pink and a blue rider in the second group. And they both have 2 energy units, so they can play mark and attack, but they play a game of chicken, right? This is a classical chicken. Both of them want to get to the front because if they both hesitate, none of them wins with certainty. But if they get to the front, they would prefer the other rider to actually do the work. So there are 2 equilibria in this game, 2 pure Nash equilibria. Well, in a normal chicken game, that would be 2, which is one attacks and the other one marks. But in this particular parametrization that we use here, the rider that attacks would actually also lose with certainty, because he would need to use up all of his energy. And the rider that plays mark coasts to the front and then can win the sprint because it's the only one with energy left. So this is a sort of a provocative example. If you add a second rider to this group, they will actually both lose, because the unique Nash equilibrium in that case is that they both play mark and nobody actually gets to the front. This changes a little bit if you if you change the composition of the energies. That's the next thing that we're going to do, but we're also going to pin this already. So this is the first pattern that we find. If you have competition of equally strong riders, they may fail to coordinate. And this is sort of immediate. This is not really an outcome of the model. It's just that if everybody's equally strong, there are no common beliefs about who should take the initiative, and this will lead to paralysis. So there will be always a mixed Nash equilibrium with positive probability of not catching up to the front group. Now, if you make one of the riders weaker, in this case the pink rider, then this changes. Now there's one Nash equilibrium, which is that the blue rider attacks and the pink rider follows. The pink rider can't attack here, but if we took energy unit levels 2 and 3, it would be the same equilibrium. It's now the stronger rider that closes the gap and the weaker rider that follows. And this leads to the black rider now being caught with certainty and all of them winning with equal probability. If we took higher energy levels for the pink and blue rider, the black rider would now lose with certainty, but there would be always equal probability ex post of the pink and the blue rider winning. And this also happens if we add a teammate. So this is the other thing that we could add heterogeneity here, or asymmetry. If we added another blue rider to the group behind, the blue team would now have one rider to burn, and they would sacrifice that rider in order to get the other rider to the front, but the pink rider would also benefit. And when that's good and when that's bad for the pink team is going to be the next thing, but for now, we note that asymmetry helps solve these coordination problems. Okay, so I'll move on to now strategic considerations for the teams. So we're going to compare two examples here again. First, on the left, we have a super simple symmetric setup. There's two riders together, and now they can do something, but they will both rest in this situation because there's no group chasing them or no one to catch for them. And then they will both have the same win probability after the game is played because they're equally strong. But if one of the riders now actually has an outside option or an exogenous threat in some way, for instance, their team leader chasing them, coming up the road with a lot of energy remaining, then this shifts the odds towards that rider. So in the example on the right, the blue rider doesn't have more energy or less energy than the pink rider, but has a very strong rider behind them, and they're both aware of this. And the only way to avoid having to compete against this very strong rider in the back is for the pink rider to actually drag the blue rider away from his own captain at the expense of exerting themselves. So in the Nash equilibrium of the game, the setup on the right, the blue team wins with probability 2/3, but always wins with a weaker rider. So there's no equilibrium where the team captain that's chasing is actually winning, but the mere presence of the captain behind them makes the blue rider more likely to win because of the strategic benefit. The pink rider knows they're being chased. And this is the same thing essentially if there is a rider in front, right? If you imagine the strong blue rider having another black rider in the group behind, the blue rider would also not close the gap to the front by referencing to his own teammate in the front group. So this is something that works in both directions, and which is very nice for the blue team. If they have riders in two groups, then both riders will be able to benefit from the presence of their teammate. The one in front says, look, I don't care if we're getting caught, so I won't ride in the front, I have a teammate behind. The one behind says, look, I have a teammate in front, I actually don't care as much if we catch them, so you do the work. And either way, however this plays out, the blue team has a rested rider in the winning group, or two, if there's the catch-up happening. And this is something that you actually see empirically a lot in cycling races. So those of you that follow cycling, especially a strong rider having a weaker rider in a front group, that's usually called a satellite rider. This has been very common these past years for teams to try to force at the beginning of the race. So especially the teams with the general classification leaders at Grand Tours, on very hard days, they will try to get one of their weaker riders, like strong but not the captain, into the breakaway of the day, so that they later have other teams having more incentive to chase. And this is something that is not happening in our model, maybe also to drop that rider back to help their captain. So yeah, blatantly riders profit from having teammates in competing groups. That's the pattern here. And then the last thing we do is, or the last pattern I'm going to show you is, so we've established now that it's very good to have riders in different groups. It's actually a bit, or what makes this more interesting is that it may actually be bad to have several riders in one group. And this is quite intuitive, I think. I'll talk you through the examples in a second, but just consider the situation. Think you're the strongest person in a group and you need to catch a group in front of you in order to win the race. then it's very nice to have a teammate because that teammate will help you close that gap. But if you're not the strongest in the group, and the strongest in the group knows that he's the strongest in the group, and you need to catch up, then the strongest will actually close the gap. So if you're weaker, it's nice for you if that strong rider has to do some work to get to the front, to weaken themselves. Now, if I'm in that situation, I'm weaker than somebody else, but I have a teammate, then the strong rider will be able to sort of push me into using my teammate to use the group, which doesn't hurt me at all. And this will benefit the strong rider more than me because he's stronger. And then he doesn't have to exert himself. This is what this sort of captures here, which we do here. So on the left, we have exactly that same that setup. We have a blue rider with 2 energy units and a pink rider with 3 energy units. And somebody needs to play attack in order to catch the black rider in front. Then in equilibrium, this will be the pink rider. This is actually an example that we already saw a little earlier, which leads to win probabilities of a half. Now, if the blue rider gets a teammate, the pressure shifts away from the pink rider to the blue team, who are now stronger in numbers. And in our model, this will actually lead to the prediction that there's a unique equilibrium where the blue rider closes the gap. And we have 1 blue and 1 pink rider drafting behind him. But the pink rider will now arrive at the finish with 2 energy units and the stronger blue one with 1, which means that there are win probabilities of 1/3 for the blue and 1/3 and 2/3 for the pink rider. So adding the blue teammate is bad for the blue rider in this situation. Whereas if you remember the last example, if that teammate were in the front group or even behind, that would not be a negative thing. That could be a positive thing, but it would definitely not be a negative thing. Yeah, so that's the last pattern. Pattern 4, adding a helper to one's group might be disadvantageous. So it's not always, there are cases in which it's positive, but there are cases in our model in which it could be disadvantageous, which is exactly if I'm not the strongest rider in my group. So this is also one thing we're going to test, but this is the only thing where we don't find evidence for. So you'll see that in a second, but just as a disclaimer, this would be super nice, but not true. So the cycling teams seem to be sophisticated in that sense. Yeah, this is the proposition, but I think I'll skip that. So we translate the theoretical patterns into hypotheses before I show you the data. So patterns 1 and 2, that was about the coordination. Symmetric groups tend to not cooperate well. Asymmetric groups tend to cooperate well. So if we have a group in the finish that arrives together, that arrive in a sprint, they should be sort of asymmetric, or they should have been asymmetric to begin with. And so we're going to look at results of big cycling races, and we're going to filter out races where there are small groups of riders arriving together. And we approximate the strength of the riders by looking at the previous season ranking in the UCI rider world ranking, which is like the world ranking, like the better riders have a better ranking there. And then we say, okay, if there's a lot of heterogeneity, so there's maybe 1 star in there and a lot of worse riders, they should be more likely to arrive together because the star would have done the work. Whereas if they're all sort of in the same ballpark, maybe there was coordination problems. The pattern 3 was riders profit from teammates in competing groups. This is something that we capture by looking at the front group and running regressions on the dummy that indicates who won from the front group. So it's a dependent variable. And we have one independent variable, which is a dummy that indicates if there was a teammate in the second group. And we check if there is a positive impact on having a teammate behind you on your probability to win from the front group. And then lastly, the last pattern, adding a helper to one's group might be disadvantageous. We check if there is a negative impact on having a teammate in my own group, given that there is another stronger rider in my group. So we look at the interaction effect of there is somebody that's a lot stronger than me in my group with I have a teammate in my group. May become a bit more clear when you see the regression table. So the data that we have, yeah, as I already said, is results data. We scrape race results from the biggest stage races, 3,700 stages total from the last 42 years. Cycling teams were a bit different in the 70s. They used to be racing for nations and not teams, and then they had different sizes in teams. So this is sort of homogeneous since the 1980s, which is why we use the data from then. Because there's essentially, I mean, there is a lot more data. If people want, I mean, I would encourage doing more with the data that's on Pro Cycling Stats. It's a lot. They collect a lot of data on all sorts of things. So we have 3,700 stages there, and we always scrape the top 15. So we collect the rider, the position, the team, the time gap, and rider characteristics. And we define a group of riders as riders that has less than 5 seconds at the end of the race between each other. This may seem a lot, actually. 5 seconds is not that little, but we also run robustness checks with 1, 3, and 10 seconds. And it's a bit different with 10 seconds, which is reassuring, but 1 and 3 seconds is pretty much the same as 5 seconds. So we use that as the middle thing. And then we create these dummies on is there a teammate behind, and we use the individual ranking of the previous season to indicate if some rider is very strong. So we call a rider a star if he finished in the top 20% of the last season. And we only look at races where small groups finish together. So there's a lot of sprints that we don't care about. There's a lot of rides where one rider arrives alone, solos that we don't care about. So we drop all the races where the third group is not complete after the 14th rider, or the 2 winning groups are solos, which would mean that there's no strategic thing going on at all in these 2 groups. They're just riding as fast as they can. And this leaves us with about a fifth of the original 825 stages. Yeah, I think there's a question.
Yes, could you explain what you mean by the third group is not complete of the 13th rider? I don't understand what you mean.
Yeah, so these groups are these packages of riders that have less than 5 seconds between each other. And once we have the results data, we can calculate these groups, and then we check the worst placed rider in the third group. And if that guy is lower than 14, then we drop it, because that means then we would need to include more than 15 riders in the top 3 groups. So this is probably the easier way to say it. What we want is we want the first 3 groups to consist of no more than 15 riders. Did that clarify it?
Yes, it clarifies, but so then you have a total of 8 to 5 stages when you use this, because I would assume that there are a lot of stages that would be excluded if you have such a rather strict criterion.
Yes.
Okay, it's clear.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, that's by design. I mean, it's lucky that we have so many stages to begin with, because we do accept to drop a lot. So again, like if you're into cycling, the sort of stages that we're interested in are ones that are won by breakaways, which aren't many.
And are these stages then rather randomly spread over the whole period?
Yes.
Or maybe you will explain it later. Okay.
Yeah. No, so I won't show any more summary statistics, but this is a good question. This is pretty evenly spread. And as I said in the beginning, we can assume that selection into these groups is sort of quasi-random, because you never know who's going to win the day 5 hours earlier.
Okay, because the pelotons were smaller in the 1980s, so then you would expect to have more such cases than nowadays.
Yeah, that's a good
point. Isn't okay.
So we use like decade fixed effects, so that should address that. But that's actually something we haven't thought about. That's a good point.
And another small remark is just technical remark. Something you mentioned: the national teams were only in the 1960s, not in the 1970s. So there were already commercial teams from the early 1970s on. So it's just a small mistake, but nothing to worry about. But I just want to mention it as well.
Yeah, but no, thank you. I think it depended on the race a little. There were they had some races. I mean, some races actually still allow national teams. Like Tour de Suisse, for instance, has a Swiss team for non-World Tour Swiss riders, and there were a few more, I think, in the 70s. So,
well,
we weren't sure.
Sometimes they added national teams along with the commercial teams, but the main competition with national teams ended, I think, in the late 1960s, especially the Tour de France and the Tour of Italy, and they constitute the largest part of your data set, I suppose. So that's maybe.
Yeah.
But yeah. I understand your point.
Thank you. Good to have cycling history buffs here. Then we can. That should make for good remarks, good quality control. Yeah, okay, so that's the data. So this is one part of the data. The other thing, as I mentioned before, is we did a robustness check we looked at all the races that we did obtain by this method between 2019 and 2023, so for 5 seasons, which are 5 seasons for which we have access to video material. And then we documented by hand the group compositions at the 1,000 meter to go mark, because there is a lot of stuff going on in the last kilometer. Right? Like for many races, the only action is happening in the last kilometer. So it was important to check that actually doesn't change anything. And what's reassuring is that on the one hand, our data, like the groups actually don't change that much in the last kilometer. And also, if you rerun our regressions with only the subset of races that we have and use the data from 1,000 meters to go, we get the same qualitative results. So this is the big data set, but if you're worried about in-race robustness, we have checked that, and it seems to work quite well. Okay, yeah, so then 2 things that we do. The first thing is a bit just to ease you in about our first hypothesis, which was that asymmetry improves coordination. We kick out mountaintop finishes as well for this analysis, because there is a lot less drafting when it's steep. It's more interesting if they are flat races, and the riders go faster, then drafting has a bigger effect. And then if we compare 2 things, which is we compare winning groups that are smaller, so 3 to 6 riders that arrive together as the first group, with a group of similar size that comes in behind a solo. So like the World Championships this year, where Tadej Pogačar soloed away, and then there was a group behind, and there was actually a lot of discoordination of 4 riders. We check these 4 riders and compare them with if Pogačar hadn't been there and these 4 arrived together. And we find that in these groups that lose against the solo, we actually have less teammates. So we have, more teams on average. And we have a lower probability of a star being present than in the comparative sample with a group that wins. So this is both sort of indicative towards asymmetry on these 2 dimensions, improving coordination. And this actually becomes significant because these percentages that I showed you here are not quite significant. But if we control for race characteristics, if you look at the thing that's circled here in red, having a helper in a group, so if a group actually arrives as the first group, it's much more likely to have 2 guys from the same team in it. Which, if you then reverse this arguing, you would expect. So yeah, if you have 2 riders of the same team in a small group, it's much more likely to actually ride a high tempo and not get caught or not have a solo rider break away from it. So this is what we do for hypothesis 1. And I think the more interesting thing is the other regression, which is about the teammate behind. So there what we do is, again, we use random effects, random and fixed, but fixed effects is the standard model that we use. Fixed effects regression with the dependent variable being just the dummy, do I win or not? Respectively, am I in the first group or not? So these are 2 different regressions. The first one is the first column of this table. We check, given that I'm in group 1 or group 2, does a rider from my team win? And how is this impacted by having a teammate in the second group? And we find that holding everything else equal, adding a rider of my team to the second group increases my win probability by about 12%. So riders that have a teammate in the second group are more likely to win from the first group, which would be consistent with those riders actually being more rested because they didn't have to do work at the front because they had this threat of an incoming teammate coming. Sorry, this is actually the second column. This was the second column, winning if I'm in group 1. Similar result holds for about actually being in group 1. So given that I'm in one of the first two groups, having a teammate behind me, so either in the third group if I'm in the second one, or in the second group if I'm in the first one, I have a higher probability of finishing in front if I have a teammate behind me. Similar size, actually, also about 12%. And these exacerbate themselves, right? So having a teammate chase my group means that I'm in a better group with higher probability. And then also I win the sprint from this group with higher probability, if that is the first group. So it's on two levels, it's a good thing. We control for a lot of stuff. It's there at the bottom for the race, for the year, stage type, rider strength, gap sizes, group sizes. One interesting robustness check, I think, is we to actually see if it's the teammate. So just in case our fixed effects miss anything, we rerun these regressions using hypothetical teams. So we don't use the actual teams of the riders, but we sort of assign them randomly to teams. And then the teammate behind effect goes away, which is to be expected, right? Because there's no actual strategic thing going on between you and the guy that we assign to your team randomly. So I think that's reassuring. So we are quite confident to say that, teammate behind has a positive effect on your prospects in a race, which confirms hypothesis 2. And this is also true in the in-race data. So these are the two samples. We have on the left the whole data set, or the old data set using the results data. So it's only the subset where we have in-race data from, but with the results data. And on the right, the in-race data for the same subset. And you can see it's very similar, the effect, both quantitatively and qualitatively. And lastly, the supposed negative effects of teammates we can't find. So if we actually look for the interaction effect between having a helper, so a teammate in my group, and having a very strong rider in my group, there's no significant effect on the win probability whatsoever, which we think is sort of to be expected, because even if teams weren't thinking about this, they would, cycling is a relatively old sport, you sort of would expect people to have like a gut feeling for where you actually want your teammate to have. And if it's bad for me to have a teammate in my group, I can just drop him back right away. This is not a stable situation. Whereas the other effect, the teammate behind effect, it's something you can't change. Right? This is a thing that you force your teammate in front of you or behind you in order to reap the strategic benefits, and it's on the competition to sort of change this. So we find this effect, but we don't find the one that the teams can actually prevent themselves. Another question.
Yeah, sorry to disturb you once again. But regarding the teammate effect, couldn't there be some kind of selection bias in your data set? I explain it. The rider with the biggest chance of winning are the best riders, but the best riders also have the best team. So the likelihood that there's a teammate in one of the groups in front or behind is much higher. If you just think about Pogacar, if he wins a race, there's a big likelihood that he will have a teammate in one of the first groups, while a lesser rider, which is still a good rider, might still be a good rider, might have not so good teammates. And couldn't that be part of what you found?
Certainly could. I mean, I think this is the best criticism of our empirical results. We address that. So we don't really claim causality. We can, because this is something that we really can't check in a quasi-random setup. We do control for the strength of the individual riders, so this should, I mean, maybe this helps a little. We did try to find a way to control for team strength, but the big problem is that it's sort of endogenous, particularly the strategic. I mean, if a team is very good strategically, is very good at using these sort of patterns, they will have a lot of good results. And if they just have a lot of very, very strong individual riders, they will also have good results, and we can't disentangle the two. So this does play a role, but it's also not sure if it's a problem or if it's a consequence of our findings.
But you address the issue in your paper then?
Yeah, we address it. I mean, we sort of in the way I do right now. So I mean, this is why we don't claim causality, and this is an issue which we can't resolve, and we couldn't come up with a way to resolve it. So this is wide open.
Okay.
I mean, this sort of is one of the I mean, this is a good because now it is over. So the discussion, one of the things that remains open is actually understanding determinants of team strength for cycling teams. There's no really good quantitative measure of that. And we sort of provide input on one of the dimensions of that. Yeah, so yeah, Alex?
Yeah, just a question. Have you completed your presentation?
Yeah, I think we can.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, because there was already champagne, so very interesting. I have a question. Probably I missed it. How do you control for the strength of the rider?
We use their individual ranking in the UCI riders ranking, which these riders collect points in every race that they compete in. And then there's an individual ranking at the end of the season. And we use their ranking from the previous season to avoid endogeneity.
Oh, okay. So that's not updated ranking just before the beginning of competition, right?
No, unfortunately not.
Okay. So yeah. And the second question is, we know that cycling is not a very clean sport, right, in terms of doping.
I mean,
well, the guy that with champagne was at Armstrong, right?
So, okay, yeah. So in our data, there's a lot of seasons that weren't clean. That's true. Yeah. Right now, I don't know.
Then the question is whether this has an effect or whether this is an alternative explanation to what you found. Because maybe those who are doped, they are so sure about themselves that they can adjust their strategies because of the doping, not because of the free rider effect or whatever.
Actually, another point. So one more thing is I mean, this doping usually happens on team levels. So this is actually another, like in your favor. If my teammate is doped, like if I have a teammate in the group behind me, if my team is strong, essentially, it could mean that we're just doped, and then my teammates are also higher up in the ranking. So we did compare. I don't think it's in the paper actually, but we did compare like these certainly unclean years where we know that almost everybody was doped with other decades, and it's sort of the same across all of our periods. And then particularly if you look at the in-race data, this is from the last 5 years, where I would say the consensus is that these guys are relatively clean. It would be very hard to dope, especially because of this, the troubled past. And because there's some arguments about the actual...
It's a super strong assumption. We don't know now. We know that the market is smarter than any regulator. So you may find out in 5 years that those who competed 5 years ago were doped. We don't really know that, and we don't really know whether the doping appears on the team's level or individual level. Sometimes it's on the individual level, sometimes it's on the team's level, especially after the revelation of Armstrong, where some teammates may speak up So I don't know how the doping interactions work, but this is something that may affect your results.
Yeah, no, I mean, definitely thanks for the remark. This is something that we thought about from early on, because if you touch cycling, this is going to come up, I think. But you could also take my argument the other way around. So in the Armstrong years, we know pretty sure that everybody doped at team level. So there we at least have homogeneity, because you have all the B samples from back then that were being tested, and they almost all doped. So, and the results hold up for this period. So if everybody's sort of, I mean, they could be doping differently, but if they're doing it efficiently, because I mean, this is top level sports, then you have that sample to verify.
And then the other question is, you defined your superstar as a 20% in the rankings, right?
Yeah.
Well, I guess superstars you don't have too many superstars, and 20% sounds like lots of superstars, don't you think?
Every fifth one. But we call them stars. And
stars,
we did, because of that, we did play around with the superstar dummy, which used like 2%. And we did like 5, 10, it was all quite similar. The problem is that these rider rankings, they're a bit difficult to read sometimes, because these riders have different like specialties. There are guys that win Grand Tours, and then there's guys that win one-day races, and then there's guys that win stages, like sprint stages, and they have difficult like distributions of how often they actually win and how many points they gain. So we chose to use a relatively large window of riders, where we would argue that if one of these top 20% guys is actually in a group, and we use small groups, like average group size for us was, I think, 3. So if there's a top 20% rider in there, he's kind of an outlier. And that's what we're interested in, because the presence of an outlier is what reduces the coordination failure.
Okay, thank you very much. It's forthcoming in the European Economic Review, right?
Yeah, should actually be like next week. It's
okay,
typesetting right now.
Congratulations. Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, thank you, Julian. Really interesting talk on cycling. Are there more questions and comments that people have? Oh.
Yeah. Yes, I want to congratulate you as well with this paper. I've been reading a lot of cycling papers. I'm very much into this sport, as you might know, and I know how difficult it is to analyze strategically what happens in cycling races. There have been numerous attempts, not that many published. I think you might have missed someone, so I really would like to see your paper with your references and maybe give you some more information. Or it's already published, but maybe you will continue to do research in this field, and then it might be interesting. But what I want to say is you of course have very strict criteria used for breakaways. It would be interesting to see more different types of breakaways as well included, or for another analysis. And what is, I think, might still be problem with what you did is you looked at specific the type of breakaways in stage races that were successful. So it often included the main riders, but then they might, you define as successful being the stage winner, but there's a lot of other issues involved as well in those races. You might just cooperate or not cooperate because you want to gain time, or you want the others to lose time. So it's not always about winning it. There's a lot more involved. And then my question would be, why did you use the selection of stage races where there always is this dimension of side prizes, King of the Mountain or time win, while in one-day races, in classics races, you don't have that. There's only about winning there, or maybe finishing on a podium. So I think doing the same or doing this analysis for one-day races would have gained more insight about really trying to win instead of so avoiding all those other motivations that might play a part in the decision why not to cooperate. What do you think about that?
There's actually, it's good that you say that, because I forgot to mention, we did this for one-day races.
Okay.
We did, and it's qualitatively the same. So this is also in the paper, in the appendix. The one issue is, or why we decided to focus on stage races in the main analysis, is that one-day races have, you usually have a very, very strong rider winning. So the actual strategic effects are smaller. Like individual strength is just a huge determinant of success in one-day races. And because they're so much harder, also so much more attritional. And this means that in the breakaways, in the one-day races, you have a lot less randomness. So we believe that for like large sample regression analysis like we did, it's more convincing to use the Grand Tours or these stage races, even though there are these problems with the incentives. And then one argument that sort of we like to distribute with respect to that is the stages that we actually look at, there are very rarely GC competitors involved in our data, because if you have like several small groups of riders arriving together in this fashion, that means that it was a breakaway stage automatically, because otherwise the GC guys usually arrive alone or in larger groups with teammates. And if you have smaller groups that arrive together, they're also very similar rider characteristics, which means that they usually have the same incentives. So it's very unlikely that you have a sprinter and somebody going for the KOM jersey in the same group. If they are in a group competing in a race that allows for several small, like intermediate-sized groups to finish together, they're probably actually competing for the stage win. It's not fully conclusive, I agree, and it's very good criticism. But I think like these are what we try to defend our analysis with.
Okay, no problem. And did you find a difference? Maybe it's also in your paper. Did you find a difference between, or did you check for difference between the stage races themselves? So is there a difference between Tour de France and the Tour of Italy, or maybe the 3-week stage races and the 1-week stage races?
I actually think we didn't look at this. I will. Thank you. I mean, it couldn't have been too different. Otherwise, we would have noticed.
I think it might be different between 3 weeks and 1 week. Maybe not between Tour de France and Tour of Italy, because that's 3 weeks and there's a lot of other dimensions going on there. But in the 1 week stage races, these are rather specific stage races, which very short, intense racing, and there might be some other dynamics behind that, I think.
Thanks.
And, one final question.
Maybe before you say this, very quick remark. We are, because I didn't go through the discussion in detail, but I would be also super interested in checking this for junior cycling and women's cycling to see if these effects are similar. And this is probably along the same dimension. So maybe at some point I'll have somebody wanting to write a bachelor's thesis or something, and I'll have them repeat this. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff.
There might be data issue there, because it's very difficult to find a lot of historic information and results, especially junior cycling. But it's a good idea. Just a final question. You said you excluded mountaintop finishes in your data set as well?
Only for the, sorry for interrupting you. Sorry, only for this particular slide.
Okay. Yeah, no problem then. Okay.
Okay, great.
Thank you for the interesting paper.
Thanks for the comments.
Great, thanks, Dan. Kind of something sprung to mind. I may have missed it. May not be relevant at all. But I presume all your data is men's races. I don't know whether there's sufficient similar data on women's races, and whether you might find the same kind of competitive patterns in women's races.
Probably not enough. We didn't try. Like I would be very interested in seeing this, particularly because I think professionalism in women's cycling has gone up by a lot in recent years. And you would expect these kinds of strategic things to be correlated with professionalism. We didn't really attempt it. Like at some point, we had all the men's stuff, but I agree that it's very interesting.
Yeah, no, it totally makes sense. I mean, it's the same in lots of sports, isn't it? That the men's data has just been there since the beginning of time, and the women's side is catching up. So it means there's lots of work to do in the future, which is nice. So, any final questions and comments from folk in the audience? Well, I guess that means we can congratulate you once again, Julian. A very nice talk and a great publication. And we wish you all the best as you carry on with your PhD.
Thank you.
And as you carry on researching in this area. Thank you very much, everyone, for your questions and comments. We will be back next week. Next week, Robbie Butler from University College Cork will be presenting. And what I realised in looking at my notes is I don't yet have a title from Robbie for his talk, but I believe it's must be on horse racing. But I will send a reminder a little bit nearer to the time, and we will be here again next Friday for another talk in the Reading Online Sports Economics seminar series. Thank you, Julian. Thank you, everyone. I wish you all a great weekend.